Okay, in this video, I want to lay a foundation for understanding motivation for learning. Now, when we're teaching learners, we kind of hope they look like this, or maybe they look like this. They're excited to learn, they're engaged in learning, they're motivated, but all too often, they look like this, kind of boxed in by a bunch of requirements and not very interested. Actually, when you do research on what teachers' biggest concerns are, it's kind of interesting because their biggest concern after the first couple of years, their biggest concern is classroom management. But after the first couple of years, veteran teachers' biggest concern is how do I motivate my kids to learn? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And one of the reasons that it's difficult to talk about this topic is because there has been a gallon of research published on it, but everybody uses different words and different terms. And it leaves us all kind of wondering how these all are related and, how they tie together or contrast or whatever. And here are just some of the terms you've probably seen regarding motivation, especially motivation to learn. And people talk about intrinsic and extrinsic. They talk about attitudes. They talk about rewards. They talk about self-efficacy. They talk about agency sometimes, or attributions, or self-determination. But all of these terms and everything can be put together in a model that I've been using for teaching for a long time. But before we get to the model, why is it that motivation matters so much? Why is it that, like I said, veteran teachers, overwhelmingly, their biggest concerns is, how do I get my kids to be motivated to really learn? Well, there's an old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can put a kid in a learning situation, but you can't make them learn. In fact, that's true of any learner. Here's another one. The fact is that learning requires the willing, not just cooperation, but engagement of the learner. So I want you to look at that little purple word there, engagement. That's another way of talking about motivation, but what it means is being truly involved, thinking about what you're doing, trying to figure it out. Engagement is not just physical, it's cognitive. And we all know what it's like to learn without engagement. Okay? And I can give you an example. Like when you are reading something that you find really, really boring. Okay? So there you are, you're reading it, it's boring, shrug, shrug, shrug. Okay? And you get to the bottom of the page, and if you're like me, you think, what did I just read? I have no idea. Oh, you read the page all right, but you weren't engaged in reading the page. Your brain wasn't turned on. Unless you're engaged, you don't learn anything. And that's why motivation is so key to any kind of learning. Before we get to looking at all the factors that impact motivation, I want to talk very briefly about two different types of learning. There's incidental learning and intentional learning. This little girl who's playing hopscotch is not intending to learn her numbers, but she's going to anyway. That's incidental learning. It's learning that happens when you're doing something else. You're not trying to learn, but you're learning anyway. Interestingly, psychologists believe that about 80% of what we learn in this life is incidental learning, not intentional at all. Most of the words that we know, for example, we have learned incidentally in conversation and later in our lives by reading. You could never, we estimate that the average adult knows something upwards toward 100,000 different words in their native tongue. There's no way you could have learned those 10 words a week in a vocabulary lesson. We learn a whole lot of things incidentally while we're doing other things. But school is about intentional learning. So even though there's this cute little numbers game here, the kid who's doing this and the teacher both know that the purpose of this activity is to learn the numbers, unlike the little girl who's playing hopscotch. So for right now, I'm going to talk not about incidental learning that you do without effort, although we're going to come back to that when we talk about playing games. But I'm going to talk about intentional learning, which requires an effort and intention on the part of the learner. Okay, and this is a model, the expectancy by value model of general motivation, and it applies to any kind of task or achievement motivation. I've drawn it originally from Atkinson's work back in the 60s, and Eccles and Wickfield in the last decade, the first decades of the 2000s, did a lot of work on a similar model. But I've added a few things and combined a few things here. Okay, so basically, expectancy by value means essentially, when we are looking at any task, including a learning task, our motivation is conditioned by two overarching questions. Do we think we're going to be able to do the task? In other words, our expectancy of success. And does the task have value for us? Our value for succeeding at the task. And you will see that underneath expectancy and value are each 5 different things that we know impact those factors. Now, one thing I want to mention is that time sign in the middle is really important. Not because I'm trying to say that you can actually mathematically calculate the amount of motivation somebody has, although there have been researchers who tried to do that, but rather because expectancy and value are related not in an additive fashion. A little bit of expectancy and a little bit of value means a little more motivation. It doesn't work like that. They're related in a multiplicative relationship. In other words, no matter how high one of them is, if the other one is 0, you won't be motivated. Here's an example. If Bill Gates were to send you a letter tomorrow and say, I am willing to pay you $1 million if you will invent a brand new operating system for PCs. We're sick of Windows, okay? Not surprising sometimes. And but the hitch here is that you have to invent this within a week. Now, how likely are you to start working on that project? Probably not very motivated to do so, because even though the value is very high, $1 million, I don't know about you, but I could use $1 million. The expectancy is low. You don't think it can be done in a week, and I think you're probably right. So 0 expectancy, high value, still 0 motivation. Likewise, I'm sure that every one of you would be able to go to your work or wherever you're going tomorrow with all your clothes on inside out. You have a high expectancy of success. It's not something difficult. But you are not motivated to do so because the value is 0. In fact, the value is negative. As far as we know, expectancy can't go below 0, but value can. So you can see you have to have both of these things. Why does that matter in terms of learning? Because very often in school, we are working on the wrong half of this equation. We take a gifted kid who's bored to death and we say, Charlie, I know you can do this. This is easy for you. It won't be any problem at all. Just go ahead and do it. You're capable of this. Well, Charlie knows that. We're working on expectancy, and Charlie's problem is value. He doesn't see any point in doing it. Likewise, on the other hand, I recently was teaching at Barrow Alternative School, and there were kids there who in 3 years of high school had managed to earn, 1 1/4 credits. And they hammered at those kids every day about how important it was to graduate and how important their diploma was. And without their diploma, they'd never be able to get a good job. They were hammering on value. But those kids' problem wasn't value. They were in that alternative school because they knew the value. They could have dropped out. Their problem was expectancy. They didn't think they could do it. They didn't see any way to graduate. So it's really important to think about what you're working on when you're talking about motivation. Okay, so let's look at the pieces of this model a little more carefully. Every one of these pieces has been carefully researched by a number of people, and I'll mention a few people whose names you might know as we go through. First, let's look at the 5 factors that we've identified here as relating to or adding to the expectancy of success. Okay, expectancy. Do we think we can do it? Self-efficacy. This is Albert Bandura's big thing. Self-efficacy is your feeling of competence in an area. So you're a lot more motivated to do something if you feel competent in that area. For example, if somebody hands me some kind of task to do with reading, I'm pretty motivated because I know basically I've never run into anything I couldn't read that was in English. Okay, there's a few things that are a little hard to understand, but I'll fight with it because I have very high self-efficacy in reading. On the other hand, tell me we're having the departmental softball game, and I am not very motivated to attend because I went all the way through gym class in school as the klutz. I'm not good at that kind of thing. The only thing I do well in terms of gym and physical education is I ride horses well. I'm good at that. And I can swim decently, but that's about it, Charlie. Never been good at games. So your general sense of self-efficacy in that area really impacts your expectancy of success. Another term you might have heard is growth mindset. This is work done by Carol Dweck, and she used to call it view of ability, but growth mindset was a lot catchier. And her work shows that if we believe our abilities are locked in, are fixed, and can't grow, then we're not very motivated. But if we believe that with effort and experience, our abilities and skill will grow, that definitely increases our motivation. So, for example, you will hear people say things like, "Oh, well, I'm not surprised little Susie's not good at math. I was never good at math. My mother wasn't good at math. We just don't have math brains." Okay, that's a very fixed mindset. The idea is either you're born with it or you're not. Okay? On the other hand, if you can convince little Susie that learning math is just a question of putting in the time and energy and effort, then she's going to be a lot more motivated. Locus of control is another great one. We're more motivated to do things that we feel some control over. If we feel like we have some choices, we have some control, and especially we have control over our success, that our success is not at the whim of somebody else, then we're a lot more motivated. For example, again, the kid who feels like that to get a good grade in class is you only get a good grade if the teacher likes you, is not really motivated to try very hard because it's out of his control. Okay? The kid who believes the teacher is grading fairly and will give a fair grade for a fair piece of work, that's a better sense of control, especially if he believes he can do it. Now, there are two other pieces that haven't been researched that much, although one of them has in the area of reading, and that is time and support. You're more motivated when you think you'll have enough time to do something. And in fact, we do know that in reading, when we give kids time to do reading, they're much more motivated to read. Think about yourself the last time, maybe none of you ever do this, I do this, where you had something to do and you left it a little late and you thought, 2-3 hours will take care of this. And then you open it and you look at it and you realize this is not a 2 or 3 hour assignment. This is like a 3-day assignment. And it's due tomorrow. Well, if you're a super good student, unlike me, you say to yourself, well, I'll put in the 2 or 3 hours I've got left today and do the best I can and then tell the teacher I had a problem. But if you're like me, like most people, you look at it and say, well, this isn't possible, and you shut the book. This really matters, by the way, in terms of time tests, because many kids don't even try on time tests because they know they can't finish. Now, we look at it and say, you're not supposed to be able to finish, but that's not how kids look at tests. They think, well, if they give me a test and I don't finish, that's really bad. And so the fact that we have research showing that if you tell kids they can have as much time as they want, many kids finish within the amount of time given on the test, but they do better if they're told they have as much time as they want than they would if they are given a time limit. So that's kind of interesting. And the last thing that really affects our expectancy is support. If we get stuck, is there going to be help? And again, think about your own experience. If you're wrestling with a new computer program and there's nobody around to help you, and the helplines are all down or they're not available because it's too late at night or whatever, it's really discouraging. It's demotivating. But if you've got a friend sitting there who says, I've used this program before. If you run into a problem, just let me know. Oh, you're ready to tackle it again, aren't you? Support really matters. Okay, now let's look at the other half of this equation. Okay, let's look at value now for the moment. The question there is, does this task or activity, or in this case learning, have value for us? And of course, the kind of value we'd all love to use is intrinsic interest. Intrinsic interest is when you're just interested in it. And of course, then it has value to you. There are two different sorts of interest. One of them is personal interest. It's something I care about. If I'm a football fan, I'm going to want to learn more about football. If I'm a mystery reader, I'm going to want to read mysteries. Okay. But the other kind of interest is situational interest. Human beings are hardwired to be basically interested in certain things. We're interested in the novel, the new. We're interested in movement. We're interested in color and light. That's why animation captures our interest so nicely. So when you're trying to interest kids in learning, ideally it'd be great if we could always connect to their personal interests, but that's not all that easy, although we could do it more than we do. And so a lot of times, like science teachers are great at this, they blow something up at the front of the room before they teach their lesson, and everybody's just fascinated. So intrinsic interest. Another thing we have going for us in value is utility value. Some things aren't that interesting intrinsically, but they give us something we want, okay? And there are two different kinds or sort of faces of utility value. One of them is I'm motivated to do this task because it gets me something I want, just that needs to get done. For example, I don't know about you, but I am not intrinsically interested in doing dishes. In fact, doing dishes is way down on my list. But again, like most of you, I have done dishes in the last few days. Not because I'm interested, but I was motivated to do the dishes because I needed clean dishes. That's utility value. We do a lot for utility value. A lot of the work we do is for utility value. Think about, again, learning. If when my washing machine was giving me trouble, I was really motivated to learn about what could be wrong with my washing machine. Not because I am fascinated by washing machines, I am just not that mechanical a person, but because I needed the washing machine to work, and I was hoping to do it without spending a lot of money. So that's one kind of utility value. The other kind of utility value that we use a lot in schools, but which is a little bit iffy, is what we used to call extrinsic motivation. In other words, somebody else gives you something. You get a reward or prize or something. And when we look at goal orientation, we're going to find out why that kind of utility value can kind of be a two-edged sword. But there's no doubt that we do things for recognition, for prizes, and also for monetary rewards. I mean, many of us go to work because we get paid for it. Now, the best kind of work is the kind of work you'd do even if you didn't get paid for it, but we all need money. So that's utility value, and it's very powerful in terms of motivation. Self-concept is another biggie, also known as self-image, by the way. We are much more motivated to do things that enhance or go along with our self-concept. If we think we're the kind of person who, I'm an athlete, so I'm much more motivated to do athletic kind of things. If I think of myself as a scholar, then that helps motivate me to read through the occasionally dry scholarly pieces that I have to read. On the other hand, if I think of myself as the bad kid in the school, then I have a lot of motivation not to do anything my teachers want me to do. So self-concept is a very powerful motivator. Another one that's very powerful is relational value. We value the things that are important to the people that we care about. So many times we do something for somebody that we care about, not because we're motivated ourselves, but because it matters to them. For teachers, this can be very, very powerful if you don't trade on it too much. But if your kids like you and value your opinion, they will do stuff for you that they're not that interested in themselves just because they want to do it for you. And the last piece of value to look at is the cost or the risk involved in the activity. And this is kind of the thing that goes on the negative side. Okay? So we are more motivated to do things if the cost or the risk looks like it's less than the potential benefits. But if the risk is really high, because risk is just an estimate of future cost. Now, lots of things can be costs, okay? Competing activities. I'm not motivated to do my homework if I have a competing activity of getting to talk with my boyfriend, and that's a lot more valuable to me, okay? But risk can also be risk of failure, risk of public humiliation, risk of anxiety. There's a lot of risks out there that kind of impact our motivation. Okay, so we had that original expectancy by value model, and we've kind of talked about how it impacts learning. So here it is revised to look specifically not at any task, but at the task of learning. Expectancy, do we expect to be able to learn? We're more motivated to learn in areas where we feel competent. That's self-efficacy. We're much more motivated to learn when we believe our abilities aren't fixed but can grow. We're more motivated to learn when we have at least some control over what we learn, how we learn, when we learn, and how quickly we have to do it. That's why giving kids choices, that's one reason giving kids choices is so powerful. We're more motivated to learn when we think help is available. So one of the worst things we do when we give kids these standardized tests is we announce at the beginning, I will not be able to answer any questions. Okay, that just demotivates some kids who are scared already. If we could just say, hey, ask whatever you want, and if I can't answer, I'll tell you. Think how much better that would be. Same idea, but better way of saying it. And we are more motivated to learn when we think we'll have enough time to learn. Value. Will learning have value for us? Intrinsic interest. We're more motivated to learn about things that are in themselves interesting. That's all that clickbait on your computer, okay? Woman born with two heads stuff. Or that personally interest us, that are related to our own personal interests. We are far more motivated to learn things that we think will have utility value to us in the future. So I may not be fascinated by the idea of figuring out how to fill out a job application. But if I'm looking for a job right now, oh yeah, I want to learn how to do that. We're more motivated to learn things that enhance rather than threaten or contradict our self-image. This is this really relates to a lot of the cultural issues that we run into in learning. So if I'm teaching social studies and I'm teaching about the westward expansion and manifest destiny, if I'm teaching Native Americans, that's pretty threatening to their self-image, isn't it? That's not going to help at all. If you're an English as a second language teacher, you know that when you teach English to people who come to this country with a different language, it's really important not to make it look like, well, English is better and that's why you have to learn English. Okay? It's not about better, or you threaten their self-image. Relational value. We're more motivated to learn when learning facilitates or enhances our relationships with people we care about. This is why the right kind of cooperative group learning, it's one reason it's so powerful. Because, and you all remember doing this in projects, you would do things because you didn't want to let your group down. That it's one of the ways you motivate yourself, right? And obviously we're less motivated to learn when the cost of trying to learn, which could be time or effort or competing activities or especially risk of failure, seems pretty high compared to any possible benefit. Okay, so we've had a chance to look at that whole model of learning, and there is one other thing I want to talk about very briefly, and it's about goals, okay? We all say we want learners to be motivated, and we do, but we need to be careful about what we're motivating them to do, okay? And learners especially have typically one of two different goals in learning. Learners that have a mastery goal, or sometimes called a learning goal, are actually focused on trying to learn. They're trying to learn the thing that they're working on or studying. But very often in school, we cause learners to have more of a performance or an ego goal. Either of those two words works. And then that's when learners are focused on looking like they're learning, or at least looking like they're not failing. And the more you focus on looking like you're learning or trying not to fail, the less you learn. Again, here's examples. If we've all known the kid who walks into a test and says, "Oh man, I didn't even study last night." Yeah. Well, he's doing that because he's trying to not look like a failure. So if he doesn't do well on the test, it's not because he's stupid or he couldn't learn it. It's because he didn't bother studying. He's too cool. If he does well on the test, man, he did that well without even studying. But we all know the activity of actually not studying does not help you learn. Several of you work in music, and this is something that we see in music too. If you're trying to play that piece beautifully, and you're into that piece, and you're trying to interpret that piece of music, you're going to play and learn to play a lot better than if you're sitting there nervous about what people are thinking of you. Okay? Unfortunately, in school, we do so much judging of children that we almost push them toward a performance or an ego goal rather than leaving them free to have a mastery goal. Okay, let's look for a minute now at motivation and specifically games for learning. Looking at the dictionary.com definition, a game is a form of play or sport, especially a competitive one, played according to rules and decided by skill, strength, or luck. So when we start to look at games for learning or learning through games, remember it says a game is a form of play. Play is to engage in an activity for enjoyment and recreation rather than a serious or practical purpose. So in a way, we've got a little bit of a paradox or a tension here, because when we as teachers use games for learning, we definitely have a serious or practical purpose. We want students to learn from the games. But from the student's point of view, if it's going to really be a game, they have to be engaging in it mainly for enjoyment. And so that tension, I think we're going to be looking at throughout the course a little bit, but especially in some of the articles for this week. And why so often people are a little resistant to the idea that you can learn through games has a lot to do with this question of, well, is a game just for fun, or can it also be for a serious or practical purpose? In fact, there's a whole category of games called serious games that I've called real life games that we're going to be looking at later. And another thing to consider is that people engage in different kind of games for different reasons, and different people engage in games for different reasons. So even when you look at the three kind of games here, well, the football player is engaging in football for probably very different reasons than the person is playing video game Legend of Zelda here, or these guys are playing their poker game. And this little girl playing hopscotch is incidentally learning her numbers, okay, but she's not engaging in hopscotch in order to learn her numbers, all right? And even a very classic simple game like Pac-Man, people play Pac-Man not primarily for money, as you might a poker game, or even for companionship, as you might a poker game, or for competition, as you might a football game. They play Pac-Man more for that sense of accomplishment at beating the game itself. Stardew Valley, a newer but well-known video game, and somebody mentioned we play that for the joy mostly of creation, for building something. Again, very different from any of the rest of these. And finally, you've got an age-old game like Ring Around the Rosie, which is not for any of these reasons except perhaps companionship. The joy of physical activity comes into a number of games, perhaps the hopscotch and certainly Ring Around the Rosie. So when we talk about motivation and games, we have to realize that there are lots of different ones. And the articles that you're going to read for this week are going to talk about some of them are going to talk about all the different sorts of motivations for engagement in games. Finally, I just want to look again at that whole idea of mastery versus performance learning, because that's an important distinction when we look at motivation theory in education, because as I talked about, mastery learning is what really gets you into the learning, whereas performance learning is more like you're trying to look like you're learning. You want the grade, you want the good judgment. And sometimes that can cause real learning, but sometimes that can really sidetrack learning. So I'm just going to take one sort of game, video games, because that's probably the game that most people look at when they think of gaming. And what are some aspects of video games that can motivate mastery learning? Well, video games help dissolve the boundaries between school and out-of-school learning. One of the problems we have with in-school learning is that many kids see it as completely unrelated to their outside lives. So even if we can take a game that they enjoy in their outside life, bring it into school and show how some of the things we're teaching are tied up in that game, that helps to draw those connections. One of the big advantages of video games is that not only is feedback instant, but negative feedback, failing, is not a disaster. In fact, if you play video games much at all, you know that you're going to fail a number of times before you even get through the first level, and that's just how video games are. And that's a really good lesson for kids to learn. Again, because in school, if you get an F on a paper, that F sits on that paper. It sits in the grade book. It may get incorporated into your final grade and end up on your permanent record. So failure is a pretty big deal, permanent kind of a thing, which does not lead toward mastery learning. It leads to something we call failure avoidance, which is like, at all costs, do not fail, or do not let anybody know you've failed. Whereas video games help you to kind of not worry about failing, because you know you're going to fail 10 times before you make it through level 1, and that's okay, because once you make it through level 1, all those failures don't count. It's a very different way of thinking. Because failure is not a disaster in video games, difficulty and challenge are sought rather than avoided. Anybody who plays video games, you know that if a game is too easy, you don't enjoy it. And a lot of times, if the difficulty level can be adjusted, you'll play a game at a certain difficulty level, and then you'll go back and adjust it and play at a higher difficulty to make it a challenge. Or in other games, you move up in level, and as you go up in level, the levels get harder and harder and more complicated. Many video games require thoughtful strategizing, planning, and sustained effort. Not all video games. I play some phone games that are over, each little game is over in like 60 seconds. But a lot of video games that people play on consoles or computers especially require real persistence in learning. And again, that's a really great lesson to learn, that some things you have to work at for a long time to make them work. One of the great things about gaming skill is it's less inherent than developed. And if you watch the video from Carol Dweck, or when you get to the rest of this week, one of the optional videos is one by Carol Dweck called The Power of Yet, which is about growth mindset, which is a word you've heard a whole lot of, but she used to call this incremental versus entity views of learning. And I explained that when we talked about the original model of motivation. And gaming skill, in terms of video games, hardly anybody says, oh, well, he was just born a good video gamer. His thumb button coordination or his mouse coordination is just born in him. No, we pretty much all recognize that you get good at video games by playing a lot of video games. That's how you get good. And again, that offers a much better model of learning, because a lot of times in school, the way that we group children, from reading is one of my research fields, a major research field for me. And we group children into reading groups as early as kindergarten or first grade. We have, the bluebirds and the cardinals and the crows. And everybody knows who the crows are, no matter how we name them. And we give kids the impression that you're kind of either born a good reader or a mediocre reader or a lousy reader. And you hear people all the time say things like, oh, well, I just can't do math. I just can't do this. So a lot of what we do in school encourages that entity view of ability. But gaming doesn't, because nobody's born a great Nintendo player. Nobody's born good at Mario Kart. You get good at it by playing it all the time. It's classic mastery. In many, many video games, especially the more complex ones, players are agents in their world. If you play a game like World of Warcraft or any of the strategy games or any of those large world creation type games, you make things happen in your world. And again, being agents is a much more motivating, mastery motivating kind of thing. In many video games, players create beyond any possibility in the real world, and they can also recreate themselves. And this is, I think, one of the huge appeals and also perhaps one of the huge dangers of video games. And that is, if I play a game like Civilization, okay, it'll take me 40 to 60 hours to play one game of Civilization. But in those 40 to 60 hours, I have started from almost nothing, just a settler, and built a world-conquering civilization, and eventually perhaps gone to the moon or taken over the whole world or who knows what. In many, many video games, you rule an empire in space, or you become the penultimate hero of the game and you save the galaxy. Okay, how often do ordinary people get to rule empires or save galaxies? Not too often. Okay, so this is one reason I think video games are so appealing, so engaging, so motivating, is because we can be giant figures in those worlds. We can be important, significant people with a relatively small investment of time. I mean, 60 hours is not really that long when you consider what it really takes to build up a world-spanning empire. I mean, even Alexander took quite a few years to do it. And most of us never get anywhere near that. It is also, I think, one of the dangers, because achievement is so much easier in video games than it is in real life, that maybe it makes real life a little harder to persist at. I don't know. It's one of the questions we have. But it certainly is one of the things that makes video games so motivating, so engaging. And also, community of gamers form spontaneous learning communities. And this is one of the things that we know encourages learning, and especially mastery-based learning. And that is, if you get on any gaming forum, any video game forum, people form their own little community where it's like, oh, did you see in level 13, if you walk over here, there's a secret, a secret extra level. Or if you go over here, there's an Easter egg. Or if you're having trouble beating level 19, here's a tip. And people actually help each other out and guide each other, and they take on roles of expert and novice and things like that, which again you don't see so often in schools at all. I mean, very rarely in schools are classes so constructed so that kids who've figured out how to do something can help other kids figure out how to do it. I really wish it was more often like that, but it isn't very often. And the real world doesn't always work that way either. And so those learning communities are another thing that makes video games incredibly motivating. So I hope you've enjoyed looking at all this, motivations, games, and games for learning, and have a good week.